Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in February 2023. We're going to be talking about the Open Information Security Risk Universe, right? Which is an amazing piece of work, released mainly by Phil Huggins, but others have contributed. And we have a great panel. We actually have a nice mix between people who use it, people who are trying to use it, people who want to learn about using it, that really should, really embrace it. And I just want to give a quick intro, and then we just go around the room, and then let's start talking about it. So, this is basically one of those great pieces of research. So let me just start. My view, right, on this project, which you can get from GitHub, is that this is one of those great projects that get dumped into the open source world that just stays there, that represents somebody's amazing piece of work at a moment in time, right? So that was basically Phil Huggins, who created a lot of this, in a project, and then he kind of moved on to a bunch of other great stuff, but and he still maintains it, but it doesn't mean that what's in here is not awesome. And I think it's one of those that he really provided a lot of pieces of the puzzle for how to think about risk. So if Phil, he's one of the thought leaders on this field, also known as ORAC, right? And he basically really connected the dots. So what basically we're going to go through here is basically try to understand a bit better what it is, understand the flows, understand basically how to get a good view of the multiple parts of it, and then I'll go through some of these in a second once we've done the introductions, and then I'll show you some more stuff that goes here. But what I really like, just from my kind of graph and map based world, is that Phil really thought of this as a graph where you have these sort of scenarios, and then you got the sources of risk who lead to risk events, who lead to consequences. And then you have the frequency and the severity. And that fundamentally allows you to have the likelihood and the consequence, which ultimately gives you the risk rating. So what I like about this was the first times I really saw a nice scalable way, assuming that you have a nice graph with all the data. If you're running these on spreadsheets, you're going to struggle, right? But if you're in a world where you start to run things in a graph way, this provides a great way of describing it. And there's some great ways and some great phrases that we'll go into here. So that's kind of the view. So before we delve more into the Open Information Security Risk Universe. And by the way, Phil, I do think you need to come up with a better name, right? Maybe call it like a bird or something, right? It's just that, OISRU, I don't even know how to say it, man. OISRU, right? Something like that. So, I'm Dinis. I've been doing risk for a while. I've been into graphs. I've been into maps, right? I'm into automation. Everything to do with graphs and maps is my world. And I really feel that risk is one of those areas that we really need to hyperlink the risk so that we connect the risk views that we provide to the execs and to make these decisions with the reality. And I think the biggest challenge we have in risk is there's a massive disconnect between reality and what we present and how we make decisions. So Eliza, who's going to come in a second, Eliza, she lives in a world where she has tons of data. She has tons of great insight. The question is, how do we connect that to business action? So I think that's what's really cool. So actually, Eliza, quick intro about you, and then maybe Sashank and then Puneet.
Yeah, great. Cheers, everyone.
Like
Is it a little bit too early? Yes, I'm drinking some Rioja.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
It's 3 o'clock here. Okay. Okay, so I'm Eliza-May Austin. I am the CEO of that security company, and you might have heard of one of our brands, which is Pocket Seam. Won't go into too much detail on that, but what I will say is Dinis is absolutely right. Something I'm really interested in is ways how different vendors and companies can work together to make information applicable to businesses. So just like you would invest in ways to secure a manufacturing plant in the UK, a lot differently to how you would supply defenses to a medical company in the US, for example, they'd be completely different. The risks would be completely different. But as a vendor, as a as a SIEM product, or if they have an internal SIEM or vulnerability management solution, they're going to be collating the same types of information, but how they use it needs to be done differently. So I'll be totally honest. I have never used this tool, this open source tool that Dinis is displaying. But what I am interested to find out about it is where the goals are going to be for this. in future, and what the plan is for it and how it can be used. Because let's face it, the MITRE attack framework started somewhere, and that's the same sort of mindset I've got looking at this, but from a more risk-based perspective rather than an indicator of attack perspective. So I hope that makes sense, and that's what I'm looking at. This is this sort of an early adoption of something as groundbreaking as the MITRE attack framework. I'll shut up now. Cheers.
Cool. Sashank, what's your angle on this, and where do you come from?
Yeah. So bit of background for the folks I think who don't know me. I'm the co-founder, CTO of Second Eyes. We are a risk-based vulnerability management product company based out of India. So what we have been trying to do is the exact problem statement which Dinis has set up, right? I mean, how do you connect these dots? There's a huge disconnect between the risk assessments done in a traditional way, as in, the threats and mapping them and then prioritizing them. And there is this whole lot of vulnerability management tools which will give you the raw data of vulnerabilities and things like that. But there's a huge disconnect between what these vulnerabilities mean to the organization, right? So that's what we have been trying to work on and pioneer. Definitely, we've burned fingers on the way. There are hard lessons that we have learned as well, which I'll be more than glad to share with you in this forum. You want me to start on that right now?
Let's go to Puneet first. And by the way, I just put on screen, you also did a great presentation, right, in one of the last summits, right, about this.
Yes.
And the video is here and the slides are here, right? This is a great presentation, again, where you're sharing a lot of your hard-learned things. So again, I highly advise anybody who wants to see. And by the way, it's a good example of the summit, right? If you go to the person's page, you actually see the past presentations, right, which is really cool. Cool. Puneet, just quickly on you.
Hi, I'm Puneet Ahuja. I'm a senior cyber risk analyst for Holland & Barrett. Relatively new. I think it's about my 10th week now that I'm in the job. And my experience with this is I've actually was introduced to this system through Dinis. And at first I didn't know what he was going on about, but then I kind of looked into it a bit more, and I saw that there was a lot of value in using this, because we're using Jira as a way of kind of being a risk register, and there was a lot of connect between using this system and being able to graph it out and to be able to report on it and to be able to define relationships with other data nodes within our Jira environment. So yeah, so I'm excited to see what we come out with this conversation.
Yeah. So Puneet is actually trying to do it. So he's part of my team, and he's basically trying to actually operationalize a lot of this, right? In a way, he's the perfect audience for this, again, for this framework, right? So let's, Sashank, before you give me, you share like your challenge, let me just give you an introduction to this, because I think it's good to have a context of what Universe is. So a good description is kind of what it says here, right? It's a framework and taxonomy for describing information security risks, independent of models, right? So, and then it kind of, this is the key thing, it breaks the security risks into sources, events, consequences, risk factors, and other things. And that for me is the key thing. So again, the way I look at it is those are all nodes in the graph, right, that we want to do. So this presentation has some really cool little nuggets, right, of how you go from a risk register, which looked like this, which kind of like, and I completely agree, right? I remember when I started looking at risk, I was thinking, what a shit show, right? Like, in one sentence, you have actions, consequences, desires, wishes, like risks, like the whole fucking thing was in one big, flow. And then of course, none of it was linked, none of it was up to date. So it was guaranteed to be out of date. So you had these huge palavers of words and stuff, but actually none of it was maintainable, right? And it's kind of like this, right? You go like risk register. Well, some of it's at controls. This is that, that's that, what the hell, right? So I completely agree with this, right? And everybody runs on spreadsheets, right? So the logic here, right? So the control is this, right? This is the normal flow, right? We get the context. And I think context is definitely a word that's coming more and more and more. Going back to Eliza's comment, right? Context is the key. We want to make sure that, when we have risks, when we have the data, we can put the right business context so that people can make decisions. Because that's the objective, right? The objective is to allow the business, allows almost the owner of the risk to make the right decisions. And this is basically the framework to do it, right? So the logic here is this is now the core of the framework is this, right? You have a scenario which is fundamentally almost a user story, even from the attacker point of view. And by the way, there's, Eliza, you mentioned the attack framework from Mitra, right? I think that is again a massive thing, and this really connects to that because you can actually start to connect this to the framework. You can take, well, here are the scenarios and here's the stuff that happens. What you then can do with this is you can graph it out. You can say, well, here are my sources that, I'm basically, in a way, are the assets, if you think about it. This is the sources of the components that you have. Here are the stuff that can happen to it, like events, right? And now here's the consequences. So if I have a database and somebody, access data is not supposed to do, I have a freaking consequence. I have data loss, right? So, but even that, the data loss, it has to be dependent on the asset. Because you could say, well, I have a database here that I don't care. Well, so what if it gets exploited? So what if, it gets exposed, right? It doesn't matter. Or I might have a bit of data here, like in our world now in HMB, right? Like our medical data. Well, we really care about that, right? So, a minor thing there is way bigger than a major thing in the database that, we don't particularly have confidential data.
Dinis,
So,
is an aspect of this almost like automating threat modeling or simplifying threat modeling on a granular level?
I would say this makes threat model very valuable, like very actually scalable.
Yeah, because threat modeling is it's an intangible thing, and having like a round table and discussing blah, blah, it's not very tangible. Whereas if you've got something that you can pinpoint on a graph to a senior leader and say, if we don't do this, this is going to happen. If it does happen, the impact isn't that bad because we've put these mitigations in place, so you can evidence it through this. Is that what you're saying? Cool.
Absolutely.
Okay, I like the idea of that. Sounds great.
So I would say this makes threat model scalable, because threat model, we do this in threat model. Like the reason I clicked on it is like, when I do a threat model in my head, that's what I'm doing. Where are the assets? What's the flows? What can we do wrong? In fact, the threat model first question is, what can go wrong? Well, guess what? That's the consequences. So what we're trying to do here is bring science to something that was kind of art, right? And the logic is exactly like we can translate this to something that the business understands, because the consequences. So I like to map risks in even this in 5 whys. So you can say, well, here's the consequence. Yeah, but why does that matter? Oh, because of this. But why does that matter? Because of that. If you do that again in a hyperlinked way, you start to reach things that the business cares about, right? And then you start to see, well, the business, you really care about continuity, or you really care about data loss, or you really care about share price, or you really care about customer data. Guess what? That is depending on this, and this has a consequence that this event to those assets will affect that thing that you care about. And so here's some examples, right? So if you look here, like sources. So this is basically the source of the attacker, right? So actually, see, I expand this a little bit because I would add also assets to here, right? But this can validly be the source of the attacker, right? So you can see you got who generates it, what's the sort of the content, what did you do, and what's the consequence? But even here, I would say that you have level 1, level 2. You kind of want level 4, level 5, level 6, level 7, because that's where you get the granularity. That's where you say, well, okay, I have reduced growth, but why? Because of this, because of that. So that's the bit that we have this connection at the moment. And I think this allows us to put science with all the data points that we have.
Yeah. So there's definitely a cool thing, Dinis, right? I mean, the challenge we see, at least, right? Operationalizing this, and as you are mentioning, contextualizing this as well, right? I mean, the sense that Eliza did mention a very good point, that each industry type have their own set of threats that are more relevant for them. Yeah. Probably if you're an e-commerce app, probably downtime is a no-no. If you're a design company, probably your intellectual property is the one that you don't want to lose, right?
Yep.
So the way I see is that to bring this to the masses, I would say, to bring it to everyone, we still have a lot of work to be done, especially on mapping these threats to industry sectors based on numerous data. Data is there, right? In the sense that there is various database, there is Verizon reports, there are a lot of HackMegadon kind of a website where they clearly represent such and such company lost such and such amount of data because of an S3 bucket that is publicly available, right? So I think, I mean, definitely I'm not so closely associated with this project. I just had a glimpse of it a couple of days back, and again, just before for preparing for this meeting. But I would say is that if there's a sort of small community, a focused community who would be likely to focus on taking it forward, I would say fixing that in the sense that what risks are relevant to which industry type is the starting point, I would say. That is one end. And the other end, the feeds that are coming in, right, in the sense that you have these scanner reports, hundreds and hundreds of them. It's a huge disconnect, right? In terms of what does it mean? I have SQL injection, but what does that mean? What does that mean to me in my context, right?
But that's us, right? Just to be clear, like we are that community, right? So I completely agree that this is not even close to be ready for prime time, and I think it's a great example of what this gives us is a framework for something that I think a lot of us has been trying to figure out for a while. And I think it's at our level now that we try to make this work, right? And I think as we make it work, eventually we'll scale out. But if we cannot, like even if you look at the multiple parties here, if we cannot, in our own worlds, use this to collaborate and to share information, to come up with ways to rationalize, you know, like you said, how you report risk, how you communicate in industry, that's the challenge.
Yeah.
Where we are now.
I could even argue that there's a multitude of ways this could be valuable, and I'll be honest, I don't fully understand what you're talking about. I'll be honest, but there's a multitude of like use cases I can see for this. So this maybe not in its preliminary stage, but like I can envisage that this could be an attribute, a common attribute to good pen test reports. So for example, you know, we found these vulnerabilities and there was no mitigations in place, blah. And rather than sending a pen test report that's bit of crap, quite frankly, you can send a pen test report that links into this. So let's take the medical industry, for example. We can say, you know, these threat actors are using these TTPs to exploit, you know, life support machines. I mean, I'm proper like going down crisis mode right now. Life support machines, and we can say, well, actually, they're aiming that just in the UK, but in the US, they're more financially motivated because of the way that the medical industry is orchestrated. So there would be I mean, I might be getting this totally wrong, and you might be sat here thinking, what is this fucking woman talking about? But there could be a way to really sort of add value. I don't have a disease, by the way, it's fake tan. I'm testing them out for allergies. There could be a way to sort of really add some sort of granular risk-based value to pen test reports, which we all agree are, I'm sure, notoriously hard to get value from as a customer.
Yep.
Does that make sense? Am I talking?
No, you spot on, because what I think is interesting, and I do believe that we need to do this from an open source and an open way.
Yeah, definitely.
We need a common way to represent data. So what you just described is that I would translate, you know, like what you said to be, we need a way to feed data, right, to a pen test report, or take a pen test report and apply a level of context to it that it actually makes freaking sense.
Yeah, because sometimes like we'll do a pen test and we'll have a call afterwards, and then the customer will be like, well, this doesn't even apply to us because we've got this thing in place. And we're like, well, great, you didn't tell us about that, but fabulous.
Or in the middle, right? Like I never forget, I was just a side note, I once delivered a pen test report where we completely own a university, like a group of universities, right? And we were finding reports, and we had some insane exploits, right? Like, it was really cool. In the middle of all that, in the middle of the whole thing, one of the execs goes up, points to one thing on the screen and says, can you change this? And I said, yeah, all of it. No,
you fix it.
That one. And he says, yeah. And then he says, everybody fucking fixed this. And you know what it was? It was the passport number. And she said, if that is proven to be exploited, that one, right? We have to shut down tomorrow. Like there was a very funny one that says like, yes, you can create fake payments. Look, I know there's a 1% payment error that we have anyway. right? So
Yeah.
join the club, right? It's almost like, hey, we can make free money. We can get money out of the system. She was like, as long as they don't take more than 1%, we don't even notice. That's how bad the system was. But it was so fascinating to think that even the things that we thought was crazy, exploitable and dangerous, it was that way in the middle. In fact, there was 5 others. Once they look at it, there was more. But it was so interesting that even we got the risk rating completely wrong. The things that we thought was insane, like, hey, we can make payments. I can take a lot of money out of the system. They were like, from a business point of view, we got that. The freaking help desk person helped himself. It's only when they buy the Ferrari that we catch them, right? So, it's an interesting angle, right, on that. And I think being able to have a way to map risk so that it's already there. So when you get your findings, you almost want these slots that you go, oh, that just changed. Like, Puneet, let me bring you in. Like, we talk about this, right? Which is, how do we scale risk throughout the business so that the people doing the findings, they don't have to do the heavy lifting because they just link to certain points of the graph.
Yeah.
How do you? Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that for me, this basically is used as the foundation, right? You kind of, once you've got these separate components, then you can build off of that, and it goes larger and larger. So in the first case, you've got your risk statement, then you've got your risk scenario, then you're classifying and almost putting them into buckets, like you've got different sets of sources, different events, different consequences. And when you do that, then you can start building these graphs and linking things together. And the great thing about that is, you might have a dozen security tools that are there to mitigate your risks. And you'll find out that out of those dozen, that 3 of them are the ones that are handling 80% of your most severe risks. And everything else is nice to have, but not necessarily, necessary. Or the flip side is, you'll find out that actually we don't have enough administrative or other types of controls after. So you've got a lot of controls before the event, but after the event, what do we have? Do we have some sort of, what's our CERT plan like? What have we got for disaster recovery? Things like that. Basically, by doing it this way, it allows you to break it up and then start mapping them like it is, like different points in a node. And then after all this, I think the best thing is then you can actually start to say, all right, we've got this risk. Now we've got to assess it. We've got to give it some sort of, how severe is it to us as a business, and then you've got to quantify it. And that's what I love about the way we're doing it within Jira, because I can easily link in, say, well, we've got a fact, link that to that risk, or we've got evidence to prove that risk has actually got X amount of financial potential damage to us. So, for me, that's where I see this has got a lot of value, because from this, everything can just build off of that.
Can I ask, Puneet, because you're using it, do you think that the value would be in particular people? So, for example, say aviation, having specialists in hacking aeroplanes, adding into the open source project. So, it, for someone like me, if someone was like, oh, we've managed to hack the plane, I might be like, oh my God, that's so scary. And then I realize, actually, it's the entertainment system. Actually, the entertainment system is completely segregated from what the pilots use. So it's not really a big deal. So is it kind of on that? Are you finding the value is to your industry that you're in, or is it just like generic value?
Honestly, right now, for me, I'm just looking at it from the point of the company I'm working for.
Okay.
So I'm not looking across the sector. I'm not looking across, industry in general, because obviously my focus is to keep the company, safe. So
yeah, but if your company, I don't know like really what your company does, but if your company was like, say, an aeroplane, a flight company.
Eliza, I'm still working on your wine with vitamins idea.
My what idea?
It's HMV, a Holland Barrett.
I can't remember what my idea was.
Was to put vitamin in wines.
Did I say that? I'm a genius.
I got that on video, but you asked me not to share.
Oh God, no, I remember you filmed me talking absolute crap when I was drunk.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up, Dennis.
sorry, you're saying.
But just to be on that one, I think that example is a great example of the kind of work that you can do where you start to connect the assets to the events, to the situation. So then you go, in a way, the event is a materialization, for example, of a vulnerability or something that can happen. And then you can argue, well, actually, the consequence for that one is very low, right? Like, okay, you hacked entertainment system, okay, but you can do this, but you don't crash a plane. So there should not be a line between hacking the information system and the plane. Now, and the plane crashing. Now, if there is, then you have bigger problems, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think, and that's the work that needs to start be done in advance, where this graph contains that information. So when you come in and solve a piece of the puzzle, so you just say, hey, you know that event is just possible, right? You know that thing that you thought was theoretical is just possible.
Are you going to need like 200 people?
Just I would like to add there for the exact use case, right? That's where the asset context in terms of the CIA ratings, the classic CIA ratings, and saying that this is an infotainment system, availability of it is not a big deal, right? Even if it's down, it's not going to impact your airplane. But if you are kind of hacking into the airplane's core network itself, then availability score will be high. That's how your risk of a scenario found on your core network of the airplane will be higher, whereas the infotainment system's risk score will be lower, right? That's the kind of context that we can bring in.
Exactly.
And then
it's just like, so Dinis always has the 5 whys. For me, it's so what? So
that's good. I like that.
Yeah. So I have an alternative for that. Big deal? Is it a big deal? Like, so what?
So what?
No, the politically correct version is the shitometer scale, right? It's like, who do you wake up? Well, like, who do you wake up? Like, do you wake up the SOC analyst? Do you wake up the SOC manager? Do you wake up the CISO? Do you wake up the business owner? Do you wake up the CEO? Do you wake up the board member? Right? Like, literally, where is it hitting right now, right? And that's the so what, right? Like, who cares about this?
But that's one of the challenges, though. When you're capturing risks, it's sometimes not easy to answer the so what, because you don't have the full situational awareness. You don't have that business context, right? Just like Dinis mentioned about when they found it at the university, right? You're thinking these are all the high risk, and meanwhile they're focused on that. And that's why engaging with the business is so important, because they've got to basically, this is, for me, this is one of the ways of being able to kind of push this to them and say, well, look, these are kind of the risks. And if they want to, start drilling down and looking more and more into the detail, because you just don't know. You think this is really high, but actually the business is saying, well, no, if that one server goes down, that's it. We're down for 2 weeks. And so you can't know everything, right?
Yeah.
What's the goal with it then? Is your aim to like have someone on the project from trains, planes? I'm going to say in automobiles. I'm sure that's a film.
So
go on.
Is
it that detailed? Is that how detailed you want to make it?
So I think a mistake that I see a lot of people do when they look at this, they freak out, right? They go, need to map everything, right? I always take the view that we already know all this. We are already doing this. Like, the reason this feels natural is because this is what we do. What we don't do is we don't leave trails behind. So what we don't do is we don't have this force multiplier that every time we part of a project, every time we do this analysis, we get better. So what we're asking here is, think about it, is how can you even come up with an assessment for a risk? You have to do this in your head. You have to say, well, I got this asset and I got these sources and I was able to do this, and I think it's this. Well, what you don't leave behind is each of those nuggets, because once you leave behind those nuggets, you can start to make them better, right? Mm-hmm. So the logic here, I think the place to start is where we are right now. So it's almost like, think about it, Eliza, you can build all this by reverse engineering your world. So you could say, well, we're finding all this stuff, or in the SOC, we just discovered all these things, right? Okay, who owns this? What are the consequences? What's the assets? What's this? So the key is, can you start to leave behind a graph? And when you start to leave, and you have a place to put it, and then that's the challenge, because most of us already experienced this, but it's all ephemeral. It's all a moment in time. It's all in your head. Like, I think of these like little fairies that instead of like nurture them and letting them grow, we just let them go, or they died or whatever. Like, I feel that we need to capture all that knowledge that we already know.
That's
So
so
every time
true.
you meet the exec, think about the wealth of information that every time you meet with a business exec, a technical person, a risk analyst, they dump on you, right? And you have all these models. You start to create them. Now, the better you are, right? And a good consultants make a lot of money out of this, right? The better you can translate some of those things, right?
Yeah.
What
So
we're trying
there
to do
are
is leave that behind.
Right?
Yeah.
So what I would like to add is having a place to store, which all these connections is one piece of the problem.
Yep.
Having what to store in that is another problem, right? In terms of what do I store in that, right? I mean, if I'm starting off, what do I store in that? So I think having these graph models is a good framework in place. Probably if we are talking about evolution of this project itself, what to feed into that and having templates of it is another good way to make people start using it and taking benefit out of it.
Absolutely.
Right. So I see that there are pockets of activities happening. For example, ISACA has a very good resource on 50 risk scenarios, right? I mean, where people have written that resource and it's available for sale and things like that, right? And there are ENISA threats, European nations, security agency, which gives us all these threats classification. And there are a lot of these pockets of information that if we can templatize it and then as a community start collecting, then putting in this graph model is like a perfect marriage of having the right model and having the right data that people can play around and customize it for themselves. And I had another point for Puneet's question on so what, right? This question comes all the time, like big deal. I mean, so what? You have shown something, right? We had moderately reasonable success in two types of conversations. One is if the leadership is super committed for the security, right? So then we say, we show this report and so what? Okay, you're going to lose your customer data, right? Or we're going to say your site will be down, right? So when the leadership commitment is there, it's like superbly well, right? Another angle, when the leadership teams are not that security savvy, the compliance stick, right, saying that it is due to a regulator that you need to do that, it kind of got decent results, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. No, use whatever works, right? I think that these days, there's already enough activity in our world to make this work. I always think that it doesn't matter where you start building your graph. What matters is you are building a graph. What matters is that we are collaborating the bits. And the other thing that I always find that the point in the beginning is not that the data in the graph is perfect. The point that you have a graph that you can ask questions. It's like, on the worldly maps concept. It's not that the map is perfect, it's that you can now talk about the map. So it's the same thing. The key here is the feedback loops, right? And the business will correct itself, especially when you add the nuclear option, right? Which is when all of these leads to risks that need to be accepted. That's the key of the puzzle. So the missing piece of the puzzle to make all of these work is to have at the end of the chain, to have a set of risks that you then give the business to accept, right? And I guarantee you at that moment in time, whoever has to be given to accept the risk, they will pay attention. And this allows us to have a framework to explain why this is high risk and why this is a low risk. It also allows a framework to ask, what are the consequences that you care about, right? And then suddenly you have these anchors, right? So if you have a financial person who says, I care about this, then that's his anchor. But then I guarantee you that the HR person is going to have a different one, and the commercial person is going to have a different one, and the CEO might have a completely different one, right? And you might even find that in a business, they're not freaking aligned, right? And we get caught in the crossfire, right? Which is why we need to then bubble this up to the stakeholders and say, hey, these are the risks, this is stuff, this is the consequences. You now figure it out and you grab the popcorn, right? And then you let them argue amongst themselves. But for me, that's reality. We already live in that world. What we don't have is a nice way to connect the dots and to learn from each other, to share. Like Eliza, going to your idea, like you should be able to receive both an open feed of a model and also a company's version of that model, so that when you put things into context, you can say, by the way, right, we're seeing this. And I would say that from where, especially the instance response and the SOC world, you will sometimes, I would argue that in the SOC, we'll get signals that, for me, are insanely worried, because they show you that your insane lack of detection. You only pick something at the end, or even more importantly, why haven't you seen this?
Yep.
So and that's the consequence, right? You go, well, if you haven't seen this, you won't see that. So that means that you will not, like, okay, somebody just took some data out. Well, if you can't see even that one, and that was not even hidden, then if somebody's dumping your customer database from the website, right? The first time you know about it is when you get a ransom request, right? Or when you have a massive data leak, or when somebody modifies all your accounts, right? So again, you can then start to go to the consequences of that.
Do you think this might?
Sorry.
Sorry. Do you Thank you. I know I'm a gobshite. I don't shut up. I'm sorry. Do you think that a sort of a wider industry, as in cybersecurity industry, not intersectional, not sexual, intersectional industry positive consequence, I think, might be sort of the deconstruction of risk as being something that you need a lot of experience in. So let me just go into what I'm talking about. I won't be too long, I promise. So everywhere I've ever worked or consulted, the best people to assess risk are usually the oldest, usually the ones that have worked in, various departments. They've been longest at the company, or they've worked in IT for a long time. And they come to risk as sort of a natural progression, that they excel in that area. They've been pushed into it. Why not? So they can look at a situation for a particular company and say, actually, if you were to make that change during hypercare, that's going to be a major issue. Or if we were to do that right now, it might impact the website, and we've got a sale on, so let's not do that. So those people are awesome. If we are sort of short on those people, and that's a talent that we're short on, and I know we're coming to talent later on in the afternoon, or later on this week rather, but if we were able to train people up to look at business risk and apply context based on known historic data out of these maps, is that something that you can see would open up the risk market as being a job market where we could get people in at a lower level? Does that make sense? Because at the moment, if you don't have someone senior assessing risk, they're a bit crap.
I think it's a bit yes. I just disagree a little bit with the last bit you said, low level. I think this is a great way to scale risk knowledge that exists inside an organization.
Yeah, so you'd make risk assessment roles accessible to people with less skill.
Because everybody in the business should be assessing risk, right? Everybody in the business,
but they're not. Like, they're not. They would want to get home to their kids and their dog. They don't give a shit.
But because they can only assess the risk in the bit that they understand, right? What we need to do is glue that together.
Yeah, I think, the thing is that every person that works in the company throughout the day is doing risk assessments in their head, right? Whether for decisions or whatnot. What this does is it allows, and I think, Eliza, this is what you're trying to come up with, is that it's a system to allow someone who does, before this, it's almost like a black art, really, isn't it? To be a really good risk analyst. This kind of allows you the framework to not necessarily have that level of experience, and then kind of build off of this, and grow off of it. And I can see that. I can see that if you not had 15 years in risk analysis, that this would be a very, very good tool to get you up to speed quickly. Yeah.
But to capture the business, right? Like the thing about this is that, so again, imagine, Eliza, in your world, like if you can hook into a part of the graph that you can say, that just became possible, I just saw this is exploitable, etc. What you want to get is the risk part for free, right? Because ultimately that bit is also not your responsibility. It's the business that needs to decide what they care about, or the government agency, or whatever, right? And that's the model. So the expert, which is the expert that understands the business and the risk and etc., they're the ones who need to make a call, right? Well, our job in security is to show, what you thought wasn't possible? It is possible, right? It's about to bring a level of reality. Or what you think is crazy, actually, that's not that easy, or that is very easy to detect, or that's very easy to mitigate. So that looks very shiny, that's no problem. This one here is the one you really need to care about. because that's the one. So we can give that, right? In security, we're the ones that can come and say, that big thing you built, I can hack it like this, right? Or, all those security stuff you have, it's all for show, right? It doesn't matter, right? But the business is the one that gives you context. And that's the bit that is missing, where we need to connect those dots and allow us to consume that data, right? In an effective way.
Puneet
So
made
yeah.
I'm so sorry. I know I'm a chat box. I was just going to say, Puneet made a point earlier about something that is probably relevant to what I'm saying, but I forgot how to link it. I'm sorry. I need a map. So I think a really good, solid example of where, there we go. He was talking about the dichotomy between sort of understanding risk and cybersecurity and then the business, and that's totally disjointed. And I think a really excellent example is the industrial control system sort of SCADA sector as a whole, and how people that are sort of in operational technology from the ground up, as in they're like engineers that's working in that space, get really frustrated with cybersecurity professionals that come in and say, I see risks everywhere. You've got a Windows 7 box, you've got Windows Vista, you've got this, you've got that, that's out of date, blah. And they're going, well, that's a £10 million piece of kit in our factory. We're not fucking changing it. We've got a license for someone else to look after it for 30 years. And we do a patch once a year, and we don't care, leave us alone. It's not even penetrable, it's a completely isolated environment. And you've got the cybersecurity people going, but it's out of date and it's a risk, and they get incredibly frustrated with us, and you can understand why. And I think that's an excellent example of where this comes into play, to educate people on the cybersecurity side, because a lot of the time it's not that we talk with authority at things like this, that we've got the answer and this particular industry is lacking in this area. But when it comes to operational technology, it's totally the reverse. They've got, a lot of the time, the answer, they're doing the right thing, they're completely segregated, and we're coming in and saying, this doesn't meet the standards of an enterprise environment that sells shoes.
Yeah.
And they go, so fucking what?
It doesn't have the business context.
Yeah. So that's exactly I was thinking of, like saying there's a missing piece of the puzzle still here. In the risk statement, often I've seen is that none of this, at least the ones that I've seen, they say who is accountable for that. Like in the risk statement, if we can say source, event, consequence, and one more column accountable, is it the business owner or the CEO or the board member or the IT guy or the whoever is that person who is accountable for that. I think that's where things start moving, because we have tried so many UI screens where we say this is your vulnerability posture, but unless you put a person against saying that this is the person, this is the team that is looking into it, things won't move.
I think you're just describing a graph, right? Isn't it funny?
No, the reason I'm laughing, and Dinis is laughing with me, is because that's what we've got built in with our Jira system. It's sometimes you have to figure out who the risk owner is, but one of the links, and this is why I like Jira, is because we have links for what's creating the risk, who's the risk owner, who's given the risk acceptance, so it's about building that scenario, right? And so by having all these different connections, and that's why I'm a big fan of Jira, because I can see all the connections. And if I don't have a connection, I build one. Let's create a new project, right? The one thing though, going back on this is, when you read over the documentation for this, they've got, the risk source, they've got the risk event, and they get the risk consequence. But when you're looking at the bow tie diagrams that they do, you've got risk outcomes. And I've always wondered why we've kind of got everything else mapped out, but we don't have risk outcomes. And I can appreciate that outcomes can be quite different, but surely we should be able to almost create a bucket for them as well, to have very generalized outcomes. Because if you're trying to do the bow tie diagrams, then it just makes sense that you can group some of these risks together based off of the same sort of outcome. And I'm just curious as to if Dinis, as to, is that something that was kind of considered or discussed within this framework?
I think what happens, right, is that Phil and the guys who created it, they solved a problem, right? A piece of the puzzle, right? And my only comment when I saw that was like, I love it. This is not going to scale, right? Unless you build a graph, right? And guess what, right? The people who are using it, they tend to use it in at smaller scale, right? They tend to use it with big risks, small things, etc. What I think is interesting is to expand this and to take it to the next level where you can connect the graphs. So we talk about Mitra, for example, attack tree, but also there's NIST frameworks, there's risk frameworks, all that stuff. All of those gives a piece of the puzzle. And basically what we're trying to do is connect that. So each of those things becomes an item in Jira that we can connect, right? And then we can graph it out, right? And that's the logic, right? The logic is that what I think the risk universe guys gave us was a really cool framework that we now need to expand and start to showing, here's a schema that works, a schema that we make it work. And that's where we should be collaborating. Because the other piece of the puzzle, just to drop this in there, is that if you look at the direction of travel, there's a push for more clarity. There's a push for start to take software much more and technology much more seriously. Now you can see that on the SBOMs, the bill of materials, all that jazz. And I think the maturity of the security, the insurance industry, and the maturing of even the government industries to start to realize that it's a freaking national critical risk to have these companies operating like cowboys from a technology point of view, because they are critical for our infrastructure. We need a way to share data. Now, I think we're very far away from sharing internal reports, right? Which eventually we should do because, right, I always felt that our industry would change overnight if all the pen test reports were published, right? Because people could not just use marketing and saying, hey, we are secure. Like, yeah, but I got these reports, right? That says you're not, right? Just for fun. There was a time where I used to do executive reports where I would take a quote from their annual report saying we are secure, and I would put a screenshot and saying this I just discovered. That is not true. I even put that, the Princess Bride thing. I don't think that word means what you think it means. I literally did several reports where I would take the freaking.
Oh my God! No wonder you're not still a pen tester. I bet they queuing up at the door to whack you on.
Yeah, that was by the end of my fantastic stuff. Dude, I'm done with this, right? Like literally, like you guys lying yourself left, front, and center, right? But the point is that I think we need to start ways, and I think the next generation is going to be a lot about context, and it's going to be a lot about providing business context. So I think that if we can be on that side of the wave, it's a massive growth area, right? Because it's about providing context to the business and forcing companies to publish this data. Like I'll find an example, like we deal with lots of third parties. I need a very effective way as a CISO to evaluate the security of my third parties, right? We're far away from getting them to disclose all the internal stuff, but if they could at least disclose the connections to some of the maps, the connections to some of the things, I'll go a long way to be able to measure the risk of those. And I think that's and this, to be honest, this will happen, and the insurance industry will force it, right? And I think the government will force it. And even the more breaches we have, the more there'll be a need we need stuff that works. And I think this could actually work.
I think this is awesome, private business to private business, if they want to disclose it. But I don't see that happening.
Oh, yeah, we're very far from it.
Happening.
No, we're very far from it. Like we first need to even make this work inside the business. I just feel that this is much bigger than this. I think this connects to a much bigger audience. And actually, I actually think this is one of those cases where the moment we figure this out internally, we will scale very fast, because it's very easy for somebody to say, well, that's the model. At the moment, everybody's afraid, even don't know how to force some regulation, because nobody understands how the hell you can make that scale.
Well, I would argue that you can take a step back, and actually the power is in industry. So forget like third parties and third party assessments and all that, granular stuff that frankly is their business, right?
Yeah.
But right now, you've got people in, the medical sector, for example, or, planes and trains that are shaking their board members and the other people in their companies and saying, do you not see what could potentially happen here? And they're going, well, I don't really understand the risk, so it doesn't get any budget. I think that's where the power is in people being able to go into a room and actually articulate and argue budget with the backing of, Dinis Cruz and Sashank Dara. I'm so sorry, I've probably just really pissed you off by saying your name wrong.
That's okay.
Saying, this guy who is an aeroplane expert wrote this. I am using it in my report, and I'm telling you this is a risk. Listen to me. and allocate me some budget to sort it out.
Yeah.
I think
And
that's what it is.
I think it's so spot on. Yeah. And the key is to make sure that that statement is connected to reality, which is what's missing today. You need to be able to say, this is problematic. Why? Because A, this is possible. B, you had these incidents. C, the industry's having these incidents. And that's the language. I think that's the power. Absolutely. Is to drive. So if you want to take a step back, the key short-term advantage of this is to allow us to have much more meaningful conversations with senior execs that will fund certain projects based on reality, not based on somebody having an opinion or somebody being able to wing their way through, to execs, which only takes you so much. Guys and girls, final comments. This is great. I love it. Let's do another session, right? Let's bring Phil. Let's use this one to bring more people around this, right? And at the next summit. Any final comments or thoughts?
Nothing. This is exciting. Looking forward to see more progress on this project.
Yeah.
Very good.
True.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was interesting to just like throw my spanner in the conversation. I don't know what I'm talking about. Short. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, you're spot on, because you are users, right? Like, I think you guys represent the users of this. That is when it can make work for you. So Puneet, one of the things I think would be really cool, like let's try to share a lot of our schema for the next summit, because I think we now have a schema that is really freaking awesome, right? And the way we start to use Jira, it starts to really connect the dots. I think let's collaborate on a Jira base, and then Eliza, you can go, well, I can hook here, and then you can say, hey, I can go here and I can fit this, and I think that would be quite a cool session to do.
Yep.
Brilliant. All right, guys, everybody, thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.